Amelia Rowe slammed the cast-iron skillet down so hard the whole kitchen shook, and when Caleb Whitaker came through that door at a dead run, she was standing over it with both fists pressed flat on the work table, staring at a man she had not seen in 3 years who was leaning in the doorway, holding a piece of paper with her real name on it. Not the name she used now, her real name, the one she had buried in Denver. The one she had run from all the way to Red Hollow, Montana, believing with everything she had left that nobody out here would ever find her. She had been wrong. If your heart is already pounding good, stay right here. Subscribe to this channel and follow Amelia's story all the way to the end, because I promise you, you will not see what's coming. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The summer of 1878 hit Red Hollow, Montana, like a punishment nobody remembered earning. Caleb Whitaker's ranch sat 4 miles east of town, past the creek crossing and up a long dirt road bordered by lodgepole pine. The land was productive. It had stopped being beautiful around the same time Eleanor died, 6 years back, and Caleb had made his peace with that. Beauty required a kind of attention he no longer had to give. What he had was discipline, and discipline kept the cattle fed and the hands paid and the whole operation moving forward, which was enough. What it did not do was cook supper. His cook had packed up 3 weeks prior, chasing a gold rumor west the way men did out here without warning, without apology, leaving behind an empty kitchen and 7 ranch hands surviving on salt pork and Caleb's own grim attempts at biscuits, which Tom Briggs had described diplomatically as filling. Caleb put an advertisement in the Red Hollow Gazette on a Monday. He expected a man. He expected someone local. At the very least, someone predictable. On Tuesday morning, he was standing on the porch with his coffee when the rented wagon from Pruitt's livery came up the road and stopped at the gate. And old Harold Pruitt dropped a woman's luggage in the dirt and was back on the road so fast, Caleb figured something awkward had been said between town and the gate. He watched her come up the road. She was young, late 20s, maybe, and she was heavy-set in a way that Red Hollow would have opinions about before she reached the porch steps. Because Red Hollow always had opinions, and they were always formed before the evidence arrived. She carried 2 heavy bags without complaint. Her chin was up at an angle that said she already knew what this property was thinking and had decided it wasn't her concern. She stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked straight at him. "Mr. Whitaker?" "That's right, Amelia Rowe." She didn't offer her hand. She didn't look around the property the way applicants usually did, sizing things up, calculating. She just looked at him. "I'm here about the cook position. You have experience?" he asked. "Enough to keep 7 men fed and out of the kind of foul mood that comes from bad food." She paused. "Yes, sir." From somewhere near the barn, Danny Holt, 19 years old, incapable of controlling his face, made a sound that was half laugh and half surprise and entirely too loud. Amelia turned her head in that direction. She didn't say a word. She simply looked, long enough for the message to land, then turned back to Caleb. "I can start today," she said. "If you want to test what I can do before you decide, I'll cook tonight's supper and let that speak for itself." Caleb considered her for a moment. He'd had 3 applicants that week. 1 drunk, 1 so young he'd seemed afraid of the stove, 1 widow from town who took 1 look at the number of ranch hands and announced the situation was not respectable before she'd even stepped inside. "That's fair," he said. "Kitchen's through the front." "I'll find it," she said. She walked up the porch steps past him without breaking stride, through the front door, and was gone. Caleb stood on the porch a beat longer than was necessary. Then he went back to work. The kitchen at the Whitaker Ranch had given up on itself around the same time Eleanor died. There was a good iron stove, a heavy oak work table, shelves that held supplies in no particular order, and a window that let in decent morning light. The kitchen garden outside had gone to weeds. It had once smelled like bread and rosemary, and whatever Eleanor was making on a given afternoon. Now it smelled like nothing much. Amelia walked in and stood still. She looked at the stove, the shelves, the work table, the window. She opened the supply cabinet and took a quiet inventory. Then she went outside, and when she came back she was carrying rosemary and thyme and sage she'd found fighting through the weeds in the old garden. And she set them on the work table, and she started cooking. She did not ask where anything was kept. She found things by looking in the places where things ought to be. And when they weren't there, she moved them to where they belonged while she was at it. At 6 o'clock she rang the dinner bell. The hands came in the way they always did. Boots scraped at the door. Bodies heavy with the day, the particular shuffling exhaustion of men who had been physical since before sunup and had nothing left to give except the minimum required to get to the table. Tom Briggs stopped in the doorway. "Lord," he said. He stood there another second, just breathing. "Tom," Danny said behind him. "You're blocking the door." "I know it," Tom said. And didn't move. The kitchen smelled like something that none of them had a clean word for. Warmth. Maybe. The specific warmth of a room where someone had taken care. It had not smelled like that in a long time. Amelia set the last dish on the table: roasted chicken with herbs. A pot of beans that had no business tasting the way he tasted given how little time she'd had. Fresh bread, roasted vegetables, a small pot of gravy that would later cause Danny Holt to write his mother a letter containing the sentence, "I did not know gravy could do that." Caleb came in last, the way he always did after one final check of the barn. He stopped in the kitchen doorway for a fraction of a second. Then he sat down. He did not speak, which was not unusual. Caleb Whitaker ate the way he did most things, steadily and without ceremony. Attentive to whatever was in front of him, not wasting energy on commentary. Then he accepted a second portion. Nobody at the table could remember him doing that before. He set his fork down, and he looked down the table to where Amelia stood at the stove, cleaning as she went, back to the room. "Miss Rowe," she turned. "You're hired. 15 a month. Room above the kitchen." He paused. "That fair?" "That's fair," she said. He rose from the table. At the door he stopped with his hand on the frame and did not quite turn around. "That was a fine supper," he said, which from Caleb Whitaker was approximately equivalent to a lesser man composing a poem about it. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker," she said. He left. The hands looked at each other. Danny reached for the bread with the expression of a man who had just had a religious experience and wasn't sure what denomination it belonged to. Amelia turned back to the stove, and in the privacy of her own back, allowed herself one long quiet exhale. She was not safe. She knew that. She had stopped believing in safe some years back. It belonged to people whose pasts stayed where they were put. Her past had a habit of traveling. It had followed her from Chicago to St. Louis, from St. Louis to Denver, and it had taken everything she had to stay ahead of it, long enough to land here. In this particular kitchen, in this particular valley. 4 miles from a town that had already formed its opinions about her before she'd done a single thing to deserve them. But she was hired, she had a room, she had a stove. For now, that was enough. The first weeks established a rhythm. She rose before the sun, started the stove, had coffee ready before the first check-in. And by the time Red Hollow was waking up, she had already done more work than anyone expected. Which was how she preferred things. Work she understood. Work didn't have opinions about the size of her body or the places she'd come from. The hands adjusted to her the way working men adjust to most improvements, gratefully. And without much analysis. The meals stopped being something to endure and started being something to anticipate. And the effect of this on the general morale of the operation was something Caleb noticed on the third day. He noticed, but he didn't say so. He rarely said what he noticed. He noticed that the men were faster in the mornings. Less friction in the afternoons. Old Hector Ruiz, who had been limping on a bad heel for 2 weeks, started eating more and complaining less because Amelia had seen the limp without being told and started cooking the kind of warming, substantial meals that make sore bodies feel like something other than a problem. He noticed she moved through that kitchen the way a skilled craftsman moves through a good workshop, no wasted motion, no hesitation, knowing exactly what every ingredient would do before she touched it. She tasted as she worked. She adjusted. The combinations she put together were things he would not have thought to expect. One morning, near the end of the second week, he came in early for coffee and found her standing at the work table with both hands pressed flat on the edge, staring at the far wall with an expression he had no category for. It wasn't grief exactly, it wasn't anger. It was something older than either. She heard him and turned, and by the time she was facing him, she was simply Amelia Rowe the cook, composed and present. "Morning, Mr. Whitaker, morning," he said. He went to the stove and poured his own coffee, leaned against the counter. She went back to her prep work, moving a bowl, measuring something. He drank his coffee. She rolled out dough without looking up. The silence lasted 3 full minutes. In the Whitaker ranch house, 3 minutes of silence between two people in the same room was not uncomfortable. It was simply quiet, he asked, finally. Not because he expected an answer worth anything, just to put something in the room. "Fine," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, finished his coffee. "Set the cup on the counter. I'll be at the north fence line most of the morning," he said. "Hans'll want lunch by noon. It'll be ready," she said. He put his hat on and went out, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed, listening to his boots cross the porch and down the steps. And something she hadn't identified yet and wasn't ready to name unclenched. Very slightly in the center of her chest, he hadn't asked. Whatever he'd seen on her face when he came in, he hadn't asked about it. She picked up the rolling pin and went back to work. It was at the end of the second week that the first trouble came. Not from the ranch, from town. She went into Red Hollow with Tom Briggs for supplies: flour, salt, dried goods, the practical necessities of feeding 9 people 3 meals a day. Routine errand. She made her selections at Gunderson's General Store, paid the account, and came out onto the boardwalk while Tom loaded the wagon. She heard them before she placed them. 2 women near the post office across the street. The kind of women who had appointed themselves the standard against which all other women in Red Hollow were measured. Whitaker's new cook, one of them was saying, not bothering to lower her voice by much. "Can you imagine? Putting someone like that in a house with 7 men. I heard she came from Denver," the other said. "Or farther east. Nobody seems to know where. Well, that alone. And the way she carries herself, like she's got nothing to be ashamed of." Amelia stood on the boardwalk with her hands folded in front of her. She looked across the street. The 2 women saw her looking. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Amelia nodded at them politely. Cleanly, the nod of a woman who has heard every word and found none of it surprising, and has already moved past it, and she turned and helped Tom with the last of the supplies. And they drove back to the ranch, and she did not say one word about it the entire way. But her bread that evening was exceptional. She had noticed years ago that her baking improved when she was angry. She had long since stopped questioning it. "This bread," Danny said, with a reverence that exceeded his usual vocabulary. "Eat it before it cools," she told him. She caught Caleb looking at her from his end of the table. Not with curiosity, with the specific quiet attention of a man who has noted that something happened today and is making a decision about whether to ask. He looked at her for one moment. Then he reached for the bread. She looked away first, and something that might have been gratitude moved through her so fast she almost missed it. The weeks turned. July deepened. The valley dried and the work continued, and the kitchen became the fixed center of the property, the way a good kitchen always does the place where the day began. Where it ended, where the temperature of things could be read if you knew how to look. She knew how to look. She knew Tom Briggs got headaches without enough salt and kept the cellar near his end of the table without commenting on it. She knew Hector Ruiz had a birthday coming in August and was already planning the cake. She knew Caleb took his coffee with 1 spoon of sugar, ate his eggs cooked hard, and made slightly better decisions on mornings when there was something substantial waiting on the stove. She had not set out to notice any of it. Noticing was simply how she was built. In the years she'd spent working in other people's houses, reading a room correctly was the difference between keeping a position and losing it for reasons that would never be explained directly. She was very good at reading rooms. What she had not counted on, in all her careful reading of this particular room, was Caleb Whitaker himself. He was not what she had expected. She had expected a man made of edges and silences and the particular kind of coldness that comes from grief that has calcified. She had expected someone who would treat her the way most employers did as a function, a necessary piece of the operation, useful and replaceable. He did not treat her that way. He repaired the broke step outside her room one morning without mentioning it. She found it fixed when she came down for the early start. The wood replaced, the nails flush. No note, no comment at breakfast. Simply done. She started making sure his coffee was ready exactly when he came in for it. Not when she happened to think of it. She started setting aside a small portion of whatever was particularly good that day, keeping it warm in case he came in late from a long ride. Small things, nothing that required acknowledgement. He didn't acknowledge them, but he noticed. She could tell because he had a particular way of going still. Briefly, when he registered something, a slight pause, a fraction of a second's attention before he moved on. She began to recognize it. One evening he came in late after 9, which was unusual, the kind of late that meant something had gone wrong out on the land, and she had a plate waiting on the back of the stove, covered with a cloth, still warm. He stopped when he saw it. He looked at it for a moment, then at her. She was sitting at the table with the account book, doing what she always did in the evening quiet. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "It's no trouble," she said, without looking up from the ledger. He sat down and ate. After a while he said, "Lost a calf at the North Creek. Ground gave way, I'm sorry," she said. "It happens." He paused. "Hector's heel giving him trouble again?" "Some. I put extra in his plate tonight." He nodded. Silence. Different in quality from the earlier ones, easier. Maybe. More inhabited. "The account's looking right?" he asked, nodding at the ledger. He hadn't asked her to do the accounts. She had simply noticed they were being kept imprecisely and started doing them correctly. "They are now," she said. "Not quite, but almost. Good night, Miss Rowe," he said, rising. "Good night, Mr. Whitaker," she said, and she kept her eyes on the ledger until she heard his boots on the stairs. And then she let herself look at the empty doorway for one quiet moment before she turned the lamp down and went up herself. The evening it all changed was an ordinary Thursday in late July. She made chicken fricassee. It was not a thing you typically found at a Montana ranch table. It required techniques she'd learned from a French chef named Beaumont, who had worked for a wealthy Chicago family, a man who had treated her skill with the kind of respect that was rare in households where she was employed. She added tarragon from the garden. She made the sauce the way Beaumont had taught her, with the specific patience and the specific combination of ingredients he always said separated a dish from a meal. She served it. The table went quiet, not the appreciative murmur of ordinary satisfaction, but the particular, focused silence of people whose attention has been entirely captured and doesn't have room left for commentary. Danny Holt's fork stopped halfway to his mouth and stayed there. Tom Briggs looked at the ceiling briefly, the way a man does when he's trying to locate a feeling. Old Hector made a sound in Spanish that Amelia decided not to translate. Caleb ate. He ate steadily and carefully and without comment, the way he always did. Then he set his fork down. He looked down the length of the table at her. And the look on his face was not performance, it was the genuine, unguarded expression of a man who has just encountered something he wasn't prepared for. "Who taught you to cook like that?" he asked. Simple question. Quiet delivery. No edge, no agenda. Just a man who had eaten something remarkable and found himself, in a completely straightforward way, wondering where such a thing came from. Amelia stopped moving. Her hand was reaching for the serving dish and it stopped. Suspended, and then it came back to the table and pressed flat against the wood. She felt something move through her chest, not pain. Not exactly. Something older. Something that lived behind the door of the life she had locked 3 years ago and walked past every day without looking at directly. The name that went with the answer to his question was a name she hadn't said out loud in 3 years. The memory attached to that name was the memory of a household in Chicago. Of 4 years of work and learning, of a future that had been assembled piece by piece through patience and trust, until the person she had trusted most in it made his decision. And she was not part of it, and the future was gone. And all that remained was what the world had decided she deserved for being foolish enough to believe a beautiful promise. She stood with her hand flat on the table. She did not speak. She could feel Caleb's attention from the other end of the table, not pressing, not demanding. The attention of a man who could wait, who had no interest in forcing. Danny Holt seemed to realize, with the delayed instincts of a 19-year-old, that something was happening that had nothing to do with food, and stopped breathing audibly. Tom Briggs studied his plate. The silence went on just long enough to have weight. Then Amelia met Caleb's eyes. "I'd rather not say," she said. Her voice was steady. It was the voice of a woman who had decided, in the span of 3 seconds, exactly how much of herself she was and was not prepared to give. Not apologetic, not afraid, just clear. Caleb looked at her for one moment more. Then he nodded one slow, deliberate nod, the kind that means understood. He picked up his fork. "Supper's real fine, Miss Rowe," he said. And from that night forward he never asked again. The men finished eating. Danny asked for a third helping with the sheepish hopefulness of a boy who knows he's pushing his luck and does it anyway. Tom Briggs leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man settling into a memory he'd keep for a long time. Old Hector said something to no one in particular in Spanish, and nodded once slowly as if confirming a theory. Amelia cleared the table, washed the dishes, banked the stove, and covered the bread starter with a clean cloth. And when she climbed the narrow stairs to the small room above the kitchen, the room with the east-facing window, the hook on the back of the door, the floorboard she'd learned to step around, she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time without lighting the lamp. Her hand found the old leather trunk at the foot of the bed. Inside it, wrapped in linen, was a book. Not large, not impressive to look at. The cover was worn, and the pages were warped from a time it had gotten damp. But every page was full recipes in her own hand. Recipes in a sharp European script that was not hers. Arguments in the margins between two people who disagreed about technique and had chosen ink over conversation to settle it. It was the one thing she had taken. When everything else was gone, the position, the references, the 4 years of carefully built life in Chicago, she had taken the book. Because the book was hers, the recipes she had modified, the techniques she had worked out through her own hours of trial, the notes she had added, those were hers. Beaumont had said so. He'd told her she had a gift that went beyond what anyone could teach, and that it mattered, and that it belonged to her. He was the only person in that house who had said so. She pressed her palm against the trunk and held it there. Outside, the Montana dark was deep and full of stars. The ranch was quiet except for a horse shifting in the barn and the distant thread of the creek. And Red Hollow was 4 miles away with its opinions and its women at the post office and its long memory for things that were none of its business. Here there was only the dark and the quiet, and the room that was hers. And the memory of a man at the end of a long table who had heard the thing she was not able to say, and had understood it, and had picked up his fork and called her supper fine, and had not asked again. She did not yet know what was coming. She did not know about the cold October morning, still months away, when a man on a fine horse would come up the road from town with her real name in his mouth and a look on his face like someone who had found something he thought he'd lost. She only knew the dark, and the quiet, and the creak, and the fragile, dangerous, absolutely necessary hope of a woman who had survived enough to understand that surviving was not a small thing. It was in the end everything. The morning after the fricassee, Caleb Whitaker came down for coffee 7 minutes earlier than usual. Amelia noticed. She didn't say anything about it. She poured his cup, set it on the counter where he liked it, and went back to the biscuits she was rolling out. He stood at the counter and drank in silence, the way he always did, watching the window the way he always did. But there was something fractionally different in the quality of the silence, less closed. Maybe more like the silence of a room with a window cracked open than a room with the shutters drawn. "Biscuits will be ready in 20 minutes, she said. "No rush," he said. He refilled his own cup, which he never did, and stayed at the counter another 10 minutes, and neither of them said another word. And when the biscuits came out of the oven, he ate 3 of them, standing up before the hands even came in, which Danny Holt witnessed and later reported to Tom Briggs with the wide-eyed energy of a man who had seen something that rearranged his understanding of the natural order. "He ate standing up," Danny said, "at the stove, like a regular person. Don't make something out of it," Tom said. "I'm just saying what I saw. I know what you're doing and I'm telling you to stop." Danny did not stop, but he did it quietly. What nobody said out loud, because this was the kind of household where things that mattered were understood rather than spoken, was that something had shifted the night before at that supper table. And everyone in the room had felt it, and nobody was entirely sure what it meant yet. But they were all, in their various ways, paying attention. Amelia was paying attention most of all. She paid attention to everything. But she paid particular attention to the things that mattered. And Caleb Whitaker, she was beginning to understand, mattered in ways she hadn't prepared herself for. That was a problem she was going to have to manage carefully. She had not come to Red Hollow to matter to anyone. She had come to disappear into usefulness, to rebuild the practical scaffolding of her life in a place where nobody knew her name, her real name, and where her past was a country too far away to follow her. She had come to cook and be paid and exist quietly, which was all she had asked of the world since Chicago. The world had not been especially cooperative with that request. But she pushed the thought down, the way she'd gotten good at pushing things down. And she made breakfast, and the day began the way the days had been beginning, with work, which was reliable, and with the particular rhythm of the ranch that she had, without entirely meaning to, made her own. It was Tom Briggs who first said something direct. He came in mid-morning for water while the others were still out on the range, and he stood at the kitchen door with his hat in his hands, in the way that meant he had something to say that he wasn't quite sure how to begin. She kept chopping. "Spit it out, Tom," he blinked. "Ma'am, you've been standing in that doorway long enough to grow roots. Whatever's on your mind, say it." Tom turned his hat around in his hands twice. "I just wanted to say what you did last night. The meal. It wasn't just good cooking, Miss Rowe. It was—" he stopped. Started again. "I got a mother back in Ohio who used to cook like that. Before she passed. That kind of cooking, it comes from somewhere." He looked at her steadily. "I don't know where you came from, and I ain't asking. But I reckon whatever you left behind, you left it for a reason that was good enough. And whatever that reason was, it ain't anybody's business out here." Amelia set down the knife. She looked at him for a long moment. Tom Briggs, who was 43 years old and had worked this ranch for 8 years, and chose his words like a man who knew their weight. "Thank you, Tom," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and put his hat back on and left. She stood at the work table for a moment after he was gone, pressing both palms flat against the wood. Then she picked up the knife and kept chopping. But her eyes were bright, and she kept them down until they weren't. August came in on a wave of heat that turned the valley dry and gold and relentless. The work on the ranch doubled fence lines to repair after the hard July winds, cattle to move to better grazing. A section of the north barn roof that had been threatening to give way for 2 seasons, and finally made good on the threat during a sudden storm that rolled through on a Wednesday night with no warning and plenty of violence. Amelia stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the lightning split the sky over the ridge, and listened to the men shouting across the yard, and had hot coffee and food waiting before the first of them, soaked and exhausted an hour later. Caleb came in last. He always came in last. He was soaked through, and there was a cut on his left forearm from a piece of roofing iron. Not deep but bleeding steadily, and he had clearly not noticed it, or had noticed, and decided it wasn't worth his attention. Which seemed about right for him. "Sit down," Amelia said. He looked at the cut. "It's sit down, Mr. Whitaker." Something in her voice, not loud, not harsh, just certain, made him pull out a chair and sit. She got the cloth and the clean water and the iodine she kept in the kitchen cabinet, because ranch kitchens needed iodine the way they needed salt. And she cleaned the cut without ceremony, and he sat still for it with the patience of a man who understood that resisting a sensible thing was a waste of everyone's time. "This needs to be bound," she said. "I know it," he said. She wrapped it. Her hands were steady and efficient, and she worked close enough that she was aware of the particular quality of his stillness, not the stillness of a man who was uncomfortable, but the stillness of a man who was paying attention to something he wasn't going to name. "You should be more careful," she said. "It was a storm," he said. "Hard to negotiate with. The roof's been threatening to go for 2 seasons. Tom told me. Tom talks a lot." "Tom's right," a beat of silence. "Then, he is," Caleb said quietly, and she got the impression that the admission covered more ground than just the roof. She tied off the bandage and stepped back. He looked at his wrapped arm, then at her. "Thank you, Miss Rowe," he said, and the words came out with a weight they hadn't carried before. Not gratitude for the bandaging, or not only that. Something underneath it. Something she recognized because she was good at reading the things underneath, the things people actually said. "Coffee's hot," she told him, and turned back to the stove. She heard him get up, heard him pour the coffee, heard him stand at the counter instead of going back out the way she'd expected. "My wife used to do that," he said. "The iodine, the cloth." She was fast about it too. Didn't fuss. Amelia kept her back to him, kept her hands moving. "She sounds like she was practical," she said carefully. "She was everything," he said. "Just that. Simple and complete." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," Amelia said. "For your loss. 6 years back," he said. He stopped. Well, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She understood the shape of what he hadn't said, the particular bewilderment of a grief that refuses to follow the timetable everyone tells you it should follow. The way 6 years can feel both like forever and like last Tuesday, depending on which room you walk into. She understood it in her own way, though what she'd lost wasn't a person in the same sense. What she'd lost was a life, a future. The version of herself that had believed good things were possible if you worked hard enough and trusted carefully enough. "Well," she agreed softly, using his word, and let it sit. He finished his coffee. "Storms pass," he said. "I need to check the damage. There's food when you come back," she said. He put his hat on. At the door he paused. "Sir, you're good at this," he said. "Not just the cooking." He went out before she could respond. She stood at the stove with a spoon in her hand and let the sentence land in her chest and tried, with limited success, not to feel the full weight of it. She felt it anyway, The next morning she found that the floorboard she'd been stepping around at the top of the stairs, the one that creaked loudly enough to wake the whole house if she hit it on her early starts, had been fixed. New wood, flush with the floor, done quietly and without comment. The way he did things. She stood on the new board and pressed her weight down on it and listened to the silence. Then she went down and started the coffee, and did not let herself think too carefully about what it meant that she noticed things like that, or that they mattered. It was the middle of August when Red Hollow decided it had something to say. Margaret Hollis arrived on a Tuesday morning unannounced. As she always did everything, because Margaret Hollis believed that arriving without warning was a kind of social virtue, a way of seeing people as they truly were rather than as they chose to present themselves. She was 55 years old, had been the social authority of Red Hollow for 20 years, and operated with the cheerful certainty of a woman who has never once been told that her certainty was not welcome. She came with a pie. People like Margaret Hollis always came with a pie. The pie was a weapon disguised as a kindness, and Amelia recognized it immediately. Mr. Whitaker. Margaret called from the porch, ignoring Amelia entirely. Though Amelia had been the one to open the door. I brought a welcome pie. For your new arrangement. The pause before arrangement was a small, precise cruelty. Caleb came out from the back of the house. Mrs. Hollis. I heard you'd taken on some help. Margaret's eyes swept over Amelia with the efficiency of a woman cataloging all the ways another woman failed to meet a standard. I wanted to come make sure everything was settled. Properly. Everything settled, Caleb said. His voice was flat and even, the way it got when he was choosing his words with extra care. Miss Rowe is the cook here. She's doing a fine job. Oh. I'm sure she's doing her best, Margaret said warmly. Which was not a compliment. She held out the pie toward Amelia without looking at her directly. The way you hold something out to a servant. You can put that somewhere. Dear. Amelia took the pie. She looked at it. She looked at Margaret Hollis. Thank you, Mrs. Hollis, she said, with a pleasantness so clean and complete that there was absolutely nothing to find fault with. And absolutely no warmth in it whatsoever. Margaret blinked. She had expected deference. She had expected the small flinch, the eyes down, the grateful murmur. She had not expected to be looked at directly by a woman she had decided to dismiss. Well, Margaret said, recovering. She turned to Caleb. I do hope you're being careful, Caleb. A man in your position. Alone out here, taking in someone who, well. She lowered her voice in the way that meant she wanted to be heard. Nobody knows much about where she came from. That does give people cause for concern. Caleb looked at her for a moment. People concern themselves with a lot of things that aren't their business. Mrs. Hollis, he said. I've noticed that tends to keep them busy enough. They don't have time for much else. Margaret's mouth opened. Closed. Good of you to come by, Caleb said. Tom will see you out. He went back inside. Tom Briggs appeared from somewhere near the barn, with the timing of a man who had been listening from a diplomatic distance and materialized exactly when needed. He smiled at Margaret Hollis with complete politeness and gestured toward the gate. Margaret left. She left with the particular rigidity of a woman who has been dismissed by someone she had not granted permission to dismiss her. And the set of her shoulders communicated clearly that Red Hollow would be hearing about this. Amelia stood in the kitchen doorway with the pie in her hands. Caleb came through the back and stopped when he saw her face. You all right? He asked. Fine, she said. She does that to everyone. I know. Amelia looked down at the pie. It's a decent pie, actually. Apple. Put it on the table, he said. Men'll eat it after supper, yes, sir. He started past her. Then stopped. For what it's worth, he said, not looking at her. Addressing some point on the middle distance, I don't care where you came from. You're here. You're doing good work. That's what matters on this ranch. He went out. Amelia set the pie on the table. She pressed both hands against the edge of the table and held them there. That evening, she took the recipe book out of the trunk. Not to look at the painful pages. There were pages she still couldn't read without her hands shaking. Pages that recorded recipes from the Chicago kitchen. Recipes written in the margin argument handwriting of her and Beaumont together. Recipes that smelled, in her memory, like a time when she had still believed she was building something permanent. She turned to the blank pages at the back. She picked up a pen. She started writing. She wrote the biscuit recipe she'd developed over the past weeks, modified from what she'd known. Adjusted for the Montana flour, which had different properties than what she'd worked with in the East. She wrote the bean recipe with the modifications she'd made here. She wrote the herb combinations she'd been experimenting with from the kitchen garden. Her recipes now, from this place. She wrote until the lamp burned low, and when she finally closed the book, something in her chest had released that she hadn't even known was tight. Tom knocked on the kitchen door at 7 the next morning, with a look on his face that meant news. Ryder came through last night, he said. Late. Stopped at the bunkhouse for water. Said there's a man in town asking questions. Amelia's hands went still on the coffee pot. What kind of questions? She said. Tom looked at her carefully. Asking about new arrivals. Women, specifically. Said he was looking for family. He paused. I didn't like the way he said it. What did he look like? She kept her voice even. Well-dressed. Too well-dressed for Red Hollow. Dark horse? Good saddle. Man who's got money and knows how to wear it. Amelia set the coffee pot down. She stood very still, Miss Rowe, Tom said quietly. You want me to Thank you, Tom. It's probably nothing. They both knew it wasn't nothing. Tom held her gaze for a moment, and in it, she read clearly that he had understood more of her situation than he had ever let on. And that he had chosen, deliberately and consistently, to be useful rather than curious. All right, he said. Breakfast smells good. 20 minutes, she said. He left. She stood at the stove and gripped the handle of the cast-iron pan and breathed. She had known, in the way that people who have been running a long time always know, that this was coming. She had known it the way you know a storm from the color of the sky hours before it arrives, not certain. Not timed, but coming, absolutely coming, and all you could do in the meanwhile was bank the stove and check the shutters and make sure the things that mattered most were somewhere safe. She thought about the trunk upstairs, the book inside it. She thought about the room above the kitchen, the fixed floorboard, the east-facing window. She thought about Caleb Whitaker saying, "You're here. You're doing good work. That's what matters on this ranch." And the way it had landed in her chest like something solid and true. She thought about all of this in the space of 30 seconds. And then she put a lid on every bit of it and made breakfast. Caleb came in at 7:15 and poured his coffee and stood at the counter the way he always did. Tom looks worried, he said. Tom worries, she said. Caleb looked at her over his cup. She could feel the look without meeting it. The careful, unhurried attention of a man who had learned to read the things that weren't being said. Anything I should know about? A pause. The exact length of a breath. No, she said. Not yet. The not yet was the most honest thing she'd said all morning. And from the way the quality of his silence shifted, she knew he'd heard exactly what it meant. He drank his coffee. He didn't push. She loved him a little for that, in the strictly practical sense of the word. In the sense that you love the thing that gives you air when you are running short of it. She would not have called it by that name. She would not have let herself near that name. But it was there, quiet and unauthorized, growing in the exact place she had told herself nothing was allowed to grow. The following week passed like a held breath. She went to town twice for supplies and kept her head down and her eyes forward and her chin at the angle that said she was aware of everything and untroubled by all of it. Which was half true on a good day. The man Tom had described, she hadn't seen him. But she felt him the way you feel something you can't see. In the way conversation stopped when she entered Gunderson's store. in the way Margaret Hollis watched her from across the street with an expression that had shifted from disdain to something more calculating. In the way the postmaster looked at her just a half-second too long when she came to collect the ranch's mail. Someone was asking questions, and Red Hollow, which had never particularly warmed to her, was answering them. She came back from town on a Thursday and found Caleb at the porch, talking with a man she didn't recognize, a traveling merchant, by the look of him, passing through with a wagon of dry goods. Normal enough. She went past them into the kitchen and started the afternoon prep. She heard Caleb's voice through the open window, patient and measured. Then she heard the merchant say, "Fine-looking setup you got here." "Your wife run the kitchen?" A pause. "My cook runs the kitchen," Caleb said. "She's good at it." Just that. Simple and without apology. "My cook. She's good at it." The same uncomplicated certainty he applied to everything that was true and didn't require defense. Amelia stood at the work table with her hands still and listened to the merchant make some polite reply and listened to the conversation move on. And she thought about the specific way Caleb Whitaker defended things, not loudly, not aggressively, but with the quiet, immovable certainty of a man who had decided what he thought and saw no reason to negotiate it. She thought about that for a long time while she made the afternoon bread. It was Danny Holt, of all people, who brought things to a head. Danny was 19 and guileless in the way that 19-year-olds are guileless, not stupid, just not yet equipped with the filters that experiences installs. He came into the kitchen that Friday afternoon with his hat in his hands and the expression of someone carrying information he wasn't sure what to do with. "Miss Rowe," he said, "I was in town this morning." "I know," she said. "You went for the hardware Caleb needed." "Yes, ma'am." And while I was there, he stopped, turned his hat around in his hands. There was a man at the saloon, buying drinks for the regulars, asking about the Whitaker ranch. He met her eyes, and in his she saw that he was not as young as he sometimes seemed. "Asking about you, not the name you go by here." "A different name." The kitchen went very quiet. "What did you tell him?" she said. "Nothing," Danny said, and his voice had a firmness in it she hadn't heard before. "I didn't know him, and I didn't like him, and I didn't tell him a single thing." A pause. "But others did. People in that bar. They talked. He's coming out here, Miss Rowe. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. But he's coming." Amelia set down the bowl she was holding. She reached out and gripped the edge of the work table. "Thank you, Danny," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He didn't move. Is there something we can do?" "Me and the men?" 19 years old. Hat in his hands, chin up, asking if there was something he could do. Tom Briggs telling her he wasn't asking where she came from. Old Hector Ruiz, who caught her eye sometimes at the table with the specific, warm recognition of a man who understood what it was to be a stranger somewhere and be judged before you'd opened your mouth. These men, this kitchen, this ranch. "Just go about your work," she said. "And thank you." He nodded and went. She stood at the work table for a long moment. Then she went to the back door and looked out across the yard to where Caleb Whitaker was working at the fence line. His back to the house, steady and unhurried, the way he was always steady and unhurried. And she thought about everything she had not told him and everything that was coming, whether she was ready or not. And she thought about the not yet she had given him that morning 2 weeks ago. And whether the yet had arrived. She went back inside. She started the supper. She made the best meal she had made since the fricassee, a slow-cooked beef stew with the last of the summer herbs. Fresh bread, a dried apple cake for after. She made it with the full weight of her attention and her skill, because she had learned long ago that when the world was about to become difficult, you did the thing you were best at with everything you had. You made it count. You made it something nobody could take from you. The men came in and ate, and the kitchen was warm and full of the sounds of men who were comfortable, forks and voices, and the particular ease of people who feel safe where they are. Caleb ate 2 full plates and said the stew was about the finest thing he'd had in years, which from him was the equivalent of a standing ovation. After supper, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was clean and the lamp was burning low, Amelia sat at the table with the account ledger open in front of her. But she was not looking at it. She was looking at the doorway. She heard Caleb's boots on the porch, heard him stop, then heard him come to the kitchen door instead of going around to the stairs the way he usually did at this hour. He knocked on the frame even though it was his own house. "Miss Rowe," he said, "a minute?" "Yes," she said. He came in and sat down across from her, which he had never done before, not at the kitchen table. Not in the evening, not just the two of them with the lamp burning and the rest of the house quiet. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at her. "Tom told me about the writer," he said, "and Danny told me about the man in town." She held his gaze. "I figured they would," she said. "You want to tell me what's coming?" A long pause. She looked at him, really looked, the way she rarely allowed herself to, taking in the steadiness of him, the patience, the complete absence of pressure in his face. A man who had repaired her floorboard without mentioning it. A man who had never asked again. A man who, when a busybody arrived with a poisoned pie and poisoned implications, had said, "You're here, you're doing good work," and walked back inside. "His name is Everett Langford," she said. "I used to know him. In Chicago." She paused. "He's not coming to find family." "Whatever he told people in that bar. What is he coming for?" She pressed her lips together. "To finish something he started 3 years ago," she said. "He thinks he can." Another pause, smaller. "He might be right." Caleb looked at her steadily. "What does he have on you?" he asked. And the question was asked with such complete lack of judgment that she felt it like a physical thing. "My past," she said. "What he made of it, what he told people." She met his eyes. "I worked in a fine house in Chicago. I learned to cook from one of the best chefs I've ever known. I was good at my work. Everett Langford was a guest of that household. He was charming and certain about the future, and I was not wise about him." She said it plainly. Without apology, without the self-flagellation she'd heard other people apply to the same story from the outside. "When he chose differently, he made sure I couldn't stay. He made sure I couldn't get a reference. He made sure the story people told about why I left was a story that followed me." She paused. "He's been finding me for 3 years. Every time I rebuild something." The kitchen was very quiet. "Why?" Caleb asked. "What does he get from it?" She almost smiled, but it didn't have warmth in it. "Control," she said. "Some men, when they can't have a thing, they'd rather destroy it than leave it alone." She looked at him. "I don't know what he's planning to say when he gets here. But whatever it is, it'll be designed to make you doubt what you know about me." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do I know about you?" She blinked. "What do I actually know?" he said, "from watching you work in this kitchen for 2 months. From what I've seen, not what anyone tells me." He looked at her with the steady, serious attention that was simply how he looked at things that mattered. "I know you're skilled. I know you're honest in your work. I know you're good to the men. I know you fixed the accounts without being asked. I know you saw Hector's heel and took care of it before I did. I know you don't waste anything, not food, not words, not other people's time." He paused. "I know that whatever you're running from cost you a great deal and you rebuilt yourself anyway." Another pause. "The weight of it deliberate. That's considerable." "Miss Rowe, that's not nothing a stranger with a story can talk me out of." She looked at him. She had not cried in 3 years. She had made a decision. Somewhere in the wreckage of Chicago, that she was done with the particular helplessness of crying. That she would be practical instead. That she would save her energy for the work of survival. She was extremely close to reconsidering that decision. "He'll say things," she said, "about my character. About why I left, I reckon he will," Caleb said. "People in town are already listening. People in town listen to everything, he said. It's their primary occupation. This is your ranch, she said. Your reputation, my ranch, he agreed. My decision about who works on it. She looked at him for a long moment. You should know what you're standing beside before you stand beside it, she said. I know enough, he said. Caleb was the first time she had used his name. They both heard it. The room held still for a moment. He didn't react to it beyond a slight quality of attention. The way you pay attention when something you've been waiting for finally arrives. I know enough, he said again quietly. The rest can wait until you're ready to tell it. She pressed her lips together. She nodded once. He rose from the table and put his chair back under it. The way he always did, the same unhurried care he applied to everything. Lock the kitchen door tonight, he said. And if anything comes up you need handled anything at all, you come get me. He looked at her with a directness that left no room for interpretation. You hear me? I hear you, she said. Good, he said. Good night, Miss Rowe. Good night, she said. He went out. She sat at the table for a long time after his footsteps faded. With the lamp burning low, and the kitchen quiet around her, and the ranch settling into the sounds of late-night distant horses. The creek, the particular deep silence of Montana after dark. She thought about 3 years of running. She thought about the man who was coming. She thought about the man who had just left, and then she blew out the lamp. And she went upstairs, and she lay on her narrow bed in the dark and looked at the ceiling and let herself, for the first time in a very long time, feel something that was not fear. She could not name it yet. She wasn't ready to name it. But it was there, warm and unauthorized and absolutely real. In the exact center of her chest. Outside, the Montana sky was enormous and dark and full of stars. And somewhere on the road between Red Hollow and the Whitaker Ranch, a well-dressed man on a dark horse was already moving. He arrived on a Friday morning just after sunrise. Amelia heard the horse before she saw it, a single rider coming up the road at an unhurried pace. The kind of pace that belongs to a man who is not worried about being received, because he has decided in advance that he will receive himself. She was at the stove when the sound registered, and something in her body knew before her mind caught up. The way it always knew. The way 3 years of running had trained her to recognize certain things in her bones before they reached her thinking. She set down the spoon. She straightened. She turned toward the window. And she watched Everett Langford ride up the road to Caleb Whitaker's ranch like a man coming home. He had not changed much. That was the first thing she noticed. And it made her angrier than she expected that he should look the same while she had been remade by everything he had done to her. He was 40, maybe 42 now, with the kind of handsome that came from money maintained rather than youth preserved. Good coat, good horse, the particular ease of a man who had never once in his life been made to feel that he did not belong exactly where he was standing. She heard him call out from the yard, heard Tom's voice answer. Cautious and flat, heard Caleb's boots on the porch. She did not go to the door. She picked up the spoon and went back to the stove. And she kept her hands moving, because her hands knew what to do, even when the rest of her was somewhere between cold fury and something that felt uncomfortably close to fear. She was not going to let it be fear. She heard the voices on the porch, Everett's smooth and carrying, accustomed to being heard, and Caleb's shorter and quieter, giving nothing. She couldn't make out the words from the kitchen, which was probably a mercy. Then she heard the front door open. Then she heard boots in the hallway, 2 sets, and then Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway. And his face was doing what his face always did when he was controlling something very carefully, which was to do almost nothing at all. Miss Rowe, he said. There's a man here says he knows you. I know who it is, she said. She did not turn around. A pause. Then Everett Langford stepped into the kitchen doorway behind Caleb, and his voice came across the room like something slicked with oil. Amelia, he said. My God, I've been looking everywhere for you. She turned around then. She turned around because she had decided, in the 45 seconds since she'd heard his horse, that she was done with the particular posture of a woman who does not turn around. She was done with her back to the room. She was done with quiet exits and careful disappearances and all the exhausting labor of making herself small enough to escape notice. She turned around, and she looked at him directly. "Mr. Langford," she said. Her voice was steady. "Whatever you've come to say, say it." Everett's face rearranged itself into something that resembled warmth. He was good at that, the rearrangement. She had once found it compelling. Now she saw it for the performance it was. "I came to talk," he said. "That's all." "Is that so hard to believe?" "Yes," she said. He made a small, wounded sound. "Amelia, after everything," she agreed. And the two words landed in the room like a door closing. Caleb had not moved from the doorway. He stood with one shoulder against the frame, arms loose, watching. He was not going to intervene. She understood this, and was glad of it, not because she needed him to stay out, but because he had correctly understood that this was hers to handle and had positioned himself as something between a witness and a wall. Available, not overriding, I think Everett said. Switching tack with the practiced ease of a man who had many tactics available. "We should speak privately." His eyes moved to Caleb with the particular look of a man assessing an obstacle. "This doesn't concern your employer." "Then why are you standing in his kitchen?" Amelia said. Everett's smile thinned at the edges. "You always were quick," he said. And the way he said it made the compliment into something else, a reminder. A diminishment disguised as appreciation. She had forgotten how good he was at that. "I've come because I'm concerned about you, a woman of your background working as a ranch cook." "This isn't what you're meant for, Amelia." "You don't know what I'm meant for," she said. "You made a decision about what I was worth 3 years ago." "That's not the same thing." Something moved across his face. Not hurt. Everett Langford did not experience hurt the way other people did. Something more like recalibration. "I made mistakes," he said. "I've come to say so." "No," she said. "You've come because someone told you I'd landed somewhere stable and you can't tolerate that." The room was completely silent. Caleb hadn't moved. Everett looked at her for a long moment. And then something shifted in his expression. The performance fell away. Just for a second, like a curtain dropping, and underneath it was the thing she had always known was underneath it. Not malice, exactly. Something colder. The flat certainty of a man who believed that things he wanted should remain within his reach regardless of what they wanted. "I have letters," he said. She went very still. "Letters you wrote me," he said. His voice dropping, becoming precise. "Letters that would be difficult to explain. Given the circumstances, given who you're working for and what kind of man he is." His eyes flicked to Caleb. "A widower, a respectable rancher, a man with a reputation in this community." Back to her. "I wonder what people would think, Amelia, if they knew the kind of woman he'd brought into his home." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Amelia had ever heard. She felt something move through her, not fear, not anymore. Something that burned cleaner than fear. Something that had been building for 3 years and had finally, in this particular kitchen on this particular morning, found the shape it needed to take. Before she could speak, Caleb said, "What kind of woman is that exactly?" His voice was very quiet. Everett turned to him with the expression of a man who had just been reminded of an inconvenience. "I'm sorry? You said people would wonder what kind of woman I'd brought into my home," Caleb said. He hadn't moved from the doorway, his voice hadn't risen. "I'm asking what kind of woman you mean." Everett looked at him. Recalibrated again. "A woman with a complicated history," he said carefully. "A woman whose her character," Caleb said, "has been visible to me every day for 2 months. I don't require your assessment of it." Everett's jaw tightened. "You don't know what she's done." "I know what she does," Caleb said. "That's generally more informative." The silence stretched. Amelia looked at Caleb at the complete unhurried solidity of him standing in that doorway. Not performing, not posturing, just stating what he knew to be true with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything, and something in her chest cracked open in a way that was not painful. Or was painful in the specific way that things are painful when they have been held shut too long and finally give. She turned back to Everett. "Get off this property," she said. Everett looked at her, then at Caleb, then at her again. He was doing the calculation, she could always see him, doing the rapid assessment of available leverage. Available exits, available angles. The letters he started. "Are letters I wrote when I was 25 years old and foolish enough to believe you," she said. "Use them however you like. I'm done being afraid of them." She took a step toward him, not aggressive. Not theatrical, just closing the distance the way you close a conversation. "You came here because you thought I'd be small enough to frighten. I'm not, I haven't been for a long time, you just didn't know it yet." Everett Langford looked at her. For the first time in the years she had known him. She watched him not know what to do. "Tom will see you out," Caleb said. Tom Briggs materialized in the hallway behind Everett with the uncanny timing he'd displayed before. And Everett, who was intelligent enough to recognize a situation that had closed around him, gathered what remained of his composure and went. They heard his horse leave the yard. The kitchen was very quiet. Amelia stood in the middle of it with her hands at her sides. And she breathed, and she kept breathing, and the shaking that she'd held out of her hands, and her voice found her knees instead and stayed there. "Sit down," Caleb said. "I'm fine." "Sit down, Miss Rowe." She sat. He poured coffee, set it in front of her, sat down across from her. The way he'd sat the night before, the two of them at the table with the rest of the house somewhere else. "The letters," he said. Not a judgment. Just the word, placed on the table between them like something that needed to be looked at. "I wrote them when I was working in the Hargrove household in Chicago," she said. Everett was a frequent guest. She stopped. Started again. He was the kind of man who makes you feel like the most important person in the room. "I understand now how he did it." "I didn't understand then." She held the coffee cup in both hands. The letters were personal, affectionate, the kind of thing a young woman writes when she believes she's building a future with someone. She looked up. "They're not," she paused, choosing. "They're not letters that would prove any wrongdoing. But taken out of context, used by someone with Everett's skill, for shaping a story, they'd be enough to raise questions. About my character. About why I was asked to leave the Hargrove household." "Why were you asked to leave?" Caleb said. She met his eyes. "Because when Everett chose not to pursue what he'd implied he would pursue," she said carefully. "And when I made the mistake of saying to Mrs. Hargrove that I believed he had behaved dishonestly toward me, Everett told his version first. He was a wealthy guest." She paused. "You can imagine which version was believed." "Yes," Caleb said. "I can." She set the cup down. "He's been following me since then." "Not constantly. He has his own life, his own business, his own society. But whenever he hears I've established myself somewhere, he appears. I don't know if it's sport for him, or if he simply can't stand the idea that I survived what he did." She looked out the window. "Either way, it amounts to the same thing." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "The letters, he still has them?" "Yes, and he intends to use them." "Yes." She paused. "Probably here. Probably in town. He knows Red Hollow already has questions about me." "It won't take much." Caleb nodded slowly. He was thinking she could see it. The same careful, unhurried way he thought about everything. Working through it from all sides before he decided anything. "All right," he said. "All right?" she repeated. "We'll need to get ahead of it," he said. "He'll go to town today. By tomorrow morning the story he tells will have traveled. So we have tonight to figure out what the truth sounds like." She stared at him. "Caleb, you said last night I should know what I'm standing beside before I stand beside it," he said. "I told you I knew enough. I still mean that. But if he's going to tell your story in town, You need to tell it first. He looked at her steadily. Not for me. For yourself. You've been running from it for 3 years. It's caught up. She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were still unsteady on the table. You're not frightened of what people will think, she said. I'm a man who buried his wife in this valley and kept going, he said. I've been the subject of Red Hollow's concern before. I'll manage. Something close to a laugh moved through her. Not quite. Not yet, but close. The first real one in longer than she could accurately measure. You're a very stubborn man, she said. Yes, he agreed. Simply, without apology. She looked at the table, at her hands. At the coffee cup. Then she started talking. She told him everything. Not the edited version. Not the version she'd perfected over 3 years of careful partial disclosure to the people she'd half trusted in the cities between Chicago and here. The whole thing. The Hargrove household. The 4 years of work. Beaumont and the kitchen and the genuine pride she'd had in her craft. Everett's arrival and the gradual, skillful way he'd made her believe she was seen and valued. The letters. The morning she'd found out he'd made his choice and she was not part of it. The conversation with Mrs. Hargrove that had gone so catastrophically wrong. The reference she'd been denied. The story that had followed her. Caleb listened without interrupting, without reacting visibly. He was the most reliable listener she had ever encountered, not because he performed listening, but because he was genuinely present and she could feel the difference. When she finished, the kitchen had been quiet for a long time. He stole your work, Caleb said. She blinked of all the things she'd expected him to say. What? The letters, the story, your reference, your position. He looked at her. But before all of that, he watched you build something valuable, and he decided he was entitled to use it for his own purposes. The rest was him covering that. He paused. It's just not the kind the law makes it easy to address. She had never heard it put that way. She had heard herself called foolish, naive, compromised. She had heard variations on what a woman in her position should have known better than to do. She had never once heard someone strip it back to the simple, plain anatomy of what had actually happened. Yes, she said. And her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. That's what it was. Then that's what it is, he said. Not a scandal. A crime he got away with. She pressed her lips together. She would not cry. She had already established her position on crying, and she intended to hold it. She held it by the thinnest possible margin. The question now, Caleb said, is what you want to do about it. She looked at him. What can I do? He has the letters. He has 3 years of practice telling the version that damages me. He has letters, Caleb said. You have Beaumont, she went still. What? The chef. The man who taught you. The one who told you the work was yours. He leaned forward slightly. Is he still in Chicago? I don't know, he was old. He may have gone back to France. She searched her memory. He talked about going back. Find out, Caleb said. Write to the Hargrove household, not to Mrs. Hargrove, to the staff. Someone there will know where Beaumont went, and if he's alive and can be reached. He'd speak for me, she said slowly. He was the only one who would have. Then find him, Caleb said. She looked at him, this man, this profoundly uncomplicated, profoundly decent man who had just taken 3 years of her nightmare and turned it into a problem with a possible solution. As if it were a fence that needed repairing, or a roof that had threatened to give. Why are you doing this? She said. He looked at her for a long moment. Because it's right, he said. And he stopped. Started again. Because you fixed the accounts without being asked. And you saw Hector's heel. And you found the tarragon in the kitchen garden when I didn't know it was still growing. He paused. Because the kind of person who notices those things and does something about them without making a fuss about it is the kind of person worth standing beside. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the yard, Danny Holt was talking to one of the horses in the low, patient voice he used with them, the one that was completely different from his regular voice. Amelia looked at her hands. "I'll write the letter today," she said. "Good," he said, pushed his chair under the table. "Everett Langford is going to Red Hollow today," she said. "He'll talk. Let him talk," Caleb said. "Truth generally outlasts a story." He went out. She sat at the table for a moment, and then she got up and she got paper and a pen from the shelf where she kept the account materials. And she sat back down, and she wrote the most important letter she had written in 3 years, not to Beaumont directly, but to Clara, the kitchen maid at the Hargrove household. The only person in that house who had hugged her on the way out and whispered, "I know the truth." "I'm sorry, I'm not brave enough to say it." She wrote carefully and completely, and when she was done she folded it and addressed it and set it on the shelf to go with the next post. Then she washed her hands and made lunch. She was very good at moving forward. It was the one skill Everett Langford had never managed to take from her. The afternoon passed with the surface calm and that had work to do regardless of what had happened in the kitchen that morning. The hands moved through their tasks. Caleb rode out to the north fence line. The sun moved across the sky, but at 3 in the afternoon, Tom came in with his hat in his hands and a look that she had learned to read accurately. "It started," he said. "Tell me," she said. "Hector went to town for the hardware." Tom paused. "Langford's at the saloon. He's been there since noon." He's another pause. "He's got people listening, Miss Rowe. He's good at it. And he's got something, papers, letters. Something he's been showing around. Margaret Hollis was there. And the postmaster and Judge Carey's wife." Amelia set the dishcloth down. "How bad?" she said. "Bad enough," Tom said. "Hector said people are talking about a community meeting." Margaret Hollis, he stopped, seemed to choose a less inflammatory word. "Margaret Hollis is being Margaret Hollis." Amelia nodded slowly. "Where's Caleb?" she said. "North fence still. I sent Danny to get him." She stood at the work table and pressed both hands flat and thought very clearly about the next 24 hours. About what Everett would do with an audience and an evening, and letters that looked like evidence of things they were not evidence of. About Margaret Hollis and her 20 years of accumulated authority over Red Hollow's opinion of what was and wasn't acceptable. About a community meeting where she would either be present or be the subject. And those were the only 2 options. "When is the meeting?" she said. Tom looked at her. "Tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock. At the church." She nodded. She had until tomorrow evening. Caleb came in at 4, still dusty from the fence line. And she told him everything Tom had told her, and he listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set and said nothing until she was done. "You're going," he said. "Yes," she said. "Good." He paused. "I'm going to her mouth." "Don't," he said. Not unkindly. "Don't tell me it's not my concern. You told me last night this was my ranch and my reputation." "You were right, which means I have standing to be at that meeting." She looked at him. "You're a very difficult man to argue with," she said. "I've been told," he said. That night was the longest of the ones she could remember. She didn't sleep much. She lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and went through the whole thing, everything she knew. Everything she didn't, every possible version of how tomorrow night could go. The ways it could go wrong, the ways it could go right. The ways it could go sideways in directions she hadn't accounted for. At some point near midnight she heard boots on the porch below her window. She went still. Then she recognized the unhurried, even rhythm of them, Caleb, walking the perimeter of the porch the way he sometimes did late when he couldn't sleep. Checking the property the way he checked everything. The boots stopped below her window, then quietly. Not loudly enough to wake anyone who was sleeping. "We'll be all right, Miss Rowe." She sat up in the dark. She looked at the window. She did not answer out loud. She didn't need to. Somehow she understood that he had not said it to get an answer. He had said it because it was true and because she needed to hear it said. And that was enough. The boots moved on. She lay back down. She did not sleep, but she stopped going through the calculations. And she held the sentence instead, "We'll be all right," and she let it be enough for the hours until morning. She was up before the sun. She made breakfast with her full attention, with the kind of deliberate care she brought to everything that mattered. Because she had learned that cooking well was not separate from being well. It was an expression of the same thing. The same refusal to do anything less than what she was capable of, even when the world was giving her reasons to give up. The men came in and ate, and were quiet in the way of people who know something significant is happening, and have to show their support by simply being present and steady. Tom ate 2 full plates and didn't say a word. Danny kept looking at her like he wanted to say something and then thinking better of it, which was probably the most mature thing she'd seen him do. Old Hector, at the end of the table, looked at her across his coffee cup with the expression of a man who had seen many things and survived most of them. And he nodded once. Caleb came in last. He ate quickly. He looked at her once across the room, with the simple, clear directness. That was simply how he looked at things he had decided about. She looked back. 7 o'clock, she thought. 12 hours. She could do 12 hours. She had done harder things with less to stand on. But as the morning moved forward, and the letter to Clara sat on the shelf waiting for the post-rider, and somewhere in Red Hollow Everett Langford was nursing his second morning drink and sharpening his story for the evening. Amelia stood at the stove and made the lunch, and she thought about what she was going to say when she walked into that church tonight and faced the people who had been deciding what she was worth since the day she arrived. She thought about 3 years of running. She thought about a man who had asked her one question, and when she said she'd rather not answer, had picked up his fork and said supper's real fine and never asked again. She thought about the recipe book upstairs with its new pages. Her recipes, her kitchen, her work. She straightened her back. She was done running. Tonight, whatever happened, she was going to stand still for it. And she was going to do it with her chin at exactly the angle she'd had it when she walked up Caleb Whitaker's road 4 months ago, the angle that said she'd already heard everything they were thinking and had decided it wasn't her problem. Except this time she wasn't going to stay quiet about it. This time she was going to speak. The ride into Red Hollow took 40 minutes. Caleb drove the wagon himself. Amelia sat beside him on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her chin at the angle. Tom Briggs rode alongside on horseback. Danny Holt rode on the other side. Old Hector Ruiz, who had announced at supper that he intended to come and had not asked anyone's permission, sat in the wagon bed behind them with his hat on his knee and his expression set in the particular way of a man who has made a decision and is done discussing it. Nobody spoke much on the ride in. The sun was going down over the ridge to the west, pulling long shadows across the valley floor, and the air had the particular quality of a late Montana evening, cooler than the day had promised, carrying the smell of dry grass and distance. Amelia looked at the road ahead and breathed it in and told herself she was ready. She was not entirely sure she was ready, but she was going. That was what mattered. "How many people you think'll be there?" Danny asked. From his horse, Tom said. "You nervous, Miss Rowe?" Danny asked. "Danny," Tom said. "It's an unnecessary question." "I'm fine," Amelia said, which settled it, though it was approximately 60% true. Caleb said nothing. He held the reins steady and kept the horses at an even pace. And once, when the wagon hit a rut and she swayed on the bench, his arm came out and steadied her, a brief automatic gesture. There and gone before either of them had to decide what to make of it. She made nothing of it. She made everything of it. The church at Red Hollow was a modest white building at the north end of Main Street, the one that leaned slightly to the left and had been leaning slightly to the left for as long as anyone in town could remember. It could hold about 80 people in reasonable comfort. When Caleb turned the wagon onto Main Street, Amelia could see light in the windows and shapes moving inside and horses at the rail 3 deep. "More than 80 people then," she breathed. "Full house," Danny said quietly. "Good," Amelia said, and surprised herself by meaning it. Caleb pulled the wagon up and set the brake and climbed down first and offered her his hand. She took it, a brief, practical grip, the kind that was about assistance rather than anything else. But his hand was warm and solid, and she held it for exactly 1 second longer than strictly necessary before she stepped down and let go. She walked toward the church with her chin up and her hands steady, and Tom and Danny flanking her at a distance that was close enough to be deliberate. At the door, she stopped. She could hear the voices inside the murmur of a room that has been talking and hasn't quite settled yet. She could hear Margaret Hollis's voice above the others. Carrying with the ease of a woman, accustomed to being the loudest person in any room she entered. Caleb came up beside her. He said quietly. She looked at the door. "No," she said, "let's go anyway." She pushed it open. The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent the way a wave recedes, starting near the door where they entered and pulling back through the crowd in a ripple. Until by the time they had walked 10 feet inside, the whole room was quiet and watching. Amelia had been looked at by rooms before. She had been looked at in the specific way that Red Hollow looked at her since the day she arrived, with the eyes of people who had already decided and were simply confirming their decision. She had learned to walk through that kind of looking, without flinching. This time it was different. This time she let herself look back. She scanned the room deliberately, meeting eyes, and what she saw surprised her enough that her stride almost faltered before she caught it. Because it was not a uniformly hostile crowd. There was Margaret Hollis near the front, rigid with purpose. There was the postmaster and Judge Carey's wife and several of the storekeepers and their wives. But there were also faces she recognized differently, the woman from the hardware store who had smiled at her twice. The young mother she'd given a jar of herb preserves to when the woman mentioned her child was sick. The old farmer who came to the Whitaker ranch occasionally for Caleb's advice on cattle, and who had eaten at her kitchen table twice and said both times that he hadn't eaten that well since his own wife passed. And in the third row, to her absolute bewilderment, sat Reverend Miles with his wife, and they were not looking at her with judgment. They were looking at her with something that resembled apology. At the front of the room, Everett Langford stood beside Margaret Hollis with the polished ease of a man at a social gathering rather than a meeting convened to question someone's character. He was holding papers, the letters. He had them in his hand where everyone could see them. Amelia walked to the front of the room. People shifted to let her through. She stood in the open space at the front, facing the crowd. And Everett was 6 feet to her left, and she did not look at him. She looked at the room. "I understand," she said, and her voice came out steady and clear and carrying. "That Mr. Langford has been telling some of you a story about me. I'd like to tell you the truth." The room stayed quiet. Margaret Hollis said, "Mrs. Rowe, Miss Rowe," Amelia said, without heat, "and I'll have the floor for a moment." "If you don't mind, Mrs. Hollis." Margaret blinked. People did not often interrupt Margaret Hollis. The room registered this with a collective, almost imperceptible shift. "I came to Red Hollow 6 months ago to take a position as cook at the Whitaker Ranch," Amelia said. "I came from Denver before that and Chicago before that. I am a woman alone, without family connections in this region. And I am aware that this fact has given some of you cause for concern." She paused. "What Mr. Langford has told you, or is planning to tell you, is that I am a woman of questionable character, that the letters he holds are evidence of impropriety, and that whatever he implies happened in Chicago is the reason I left." She heard the room breathe. "Here is what actually happened," she said. "I worked for 4 years in the Hargrove household in Chicago as their cook. I was good at my work. I was trained by one of the best chefs I have ever known, a man named Beaumont, and I learned everything he could teach me, and then I kept learning on my own. I was proud of that work. I had a right to be. She stopped, drew a breath, kept going. Everett Langford was a guest of that household. He was charming and persuasive, and he made me believe he valued what I was building. I wrote him letters because I thought we had an understanding. When he chose differently, when he found a better opportunity elsewhere, he made sure that I could not stay in that household. Could not get a reference, could not defend myself against the version of events he told first. She met the eyes of the room without flinching. He has been finding me since then. Every time I rebuild, he appears. I don't know all his reasons. I know that some men, when they cannot have a thing, prefer to damage it. The room was absolutely still. Everett said, "This is a remarkable performance. You'll have your turn," Caleb said from somewhere behind her. And the quiet authority in his voice closed Everett's mouth like a door. "I came here ashamed," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I came here carrying what he did to me, the way women are taught to carry things, as though it were mine to carry. As though I had done something wrong by trusting someone who was not trustworthy." She paused. "I am done with that." She looked out at the room. "I am a good cook. I am an honest worker. I have given everything I have to the work I do on that ranch. And I am not going to stand here and apologize for surviving what was done to me." Silence. Then, from the third row, the Reverend's wife said, "Hear, hear." It wasn't loud, but it landed. And then Margaret Hollis did something that nobody in the room expected, including possibly Margaret Hollis herself. She looked at the papers in Everett Langford's hand. She looked at them for a long moment, and then she looked at Amelia. And on her face, on the face of the woman who had arrived at the ranch with a poisoned pie and a practiced cruelty, was something that was not quite shame but lived in its neighborhood. "Mr. Langford," Margaret said, and her voice was different. Cooler, more precise. "You told me this afternoon that these letters proved this woman had engaged in immoral conduct. They demonstrate," Everett began. "You told me," Margaret said, cutting him off with the confidence of a woman who has been the social authority of a community for 20 years and has just decided to use that authority differently. "That the letters were explicit, that they were evidence of behavior unbecoming a woman in a respectable household." She looked at the papers. "Are they?" A pause. "They demonstrate a relationship. Are they explicit?" Margaret said. "Yes or no?" The room waited. Everett's jaw tightened. "They demonstrate an inappropriate familiarity." "That is not what you told me," Margaret said. She looked at the room. She looked back at him, and then she turned to Amelia. And she said something that clearly cost her. "I owe you an apology, Miss Rowe. I was told a particular story, and I did not ask the right questions before I helped bring this meeting about." She paused. "I am asking them now." The room was stunned. Amelia was stunned. She kept it off her face, but only barely. Everett Langford looked at Margaret Hollis and understood that his primary ally had just changed sides. And the understanding moved across his face like a shadow crossing a field fast. And then gone, replaced by the smooth surface he maintained. "The letters speak for themselves," he said, and held them up. "Anyone who wishes to read." "I'll take those," said a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway, with a traveling coat still on and a bag in hand, and the expression of a man who had been on the road for 3 days and was not in a patient mood about it, was a compact, elderly man with silver hair, sharp, dark eyes, and the upright bearing of someone accustomed to professional kitchens. Amelia's breath stopped. It was Beaumont, who had been born in Lyon and had cooked for wealthy houses in 3 countries, who had taught her everything she knew about the difference between good food and great food, who had told her the work was hers, who had called her gift genuine and said it mattered. Henri Beaumont, who she had thought might be back in France, and who she had written to through Clara 3 weeks ago and had not yet received an answer from, was standing in the doorway of the Red Hollow Church with the expression of a man who has traveled a very long way specifically to say something. She could not speak. She tried and found she had no words available. Beaumont walked to the front of the room. He was 70 if he was a day, and he moved with the deliberate precision of a man who was not slowing down for anything and expected the room to understand this. He stopped in front of Everett Langford and held out his hand. "The letters," he said. His English was precise and slightly formal and entirely without deference. "Please." Everett stared at him. "Henri Beaumont," the old man said. "I was the head chef of the Hargrove household in Chicago from 1871 to 1877. I trained Miss Rowe. I know everything that happened in that household, including what you did and what you told people afterward." He kept his hand extended. "The letters, if you please, or I will tell this room, in considerable detail, the version of events that I witnessed myself." The silence was the kind that presses against the walls. Everett Langford looked at the old chef. He looked at the room. He looked at Margaret Hollis, who was looking at him with an expression that had gone entirely flat and cold. He looked at Caleb Whitaker, who was standing at the back of the room with Tom Briggs and Danny Holt and Hector Ruiz, and who was looking at him with the patient, uncomplicated attention of a man who has all the time in the world and none of the anxiety. He put the letters in Beaumont's hand. Beaumont took them. He put them inside his coat without looking at them. Then he turned to the room. "My name is Henri Beaumont," he said. "I have cooked for some of the finest households in Europe and in this country. In 6 years at the Hargrove household, I trained many assistants. Amelia Rowe was the most gifted of all of them." He paused. And the pause was deliberate, a chef's timing applied to language. She did not leave that position because of any failing on her part. She left because she was pushed out by a man who found it convenient to damage her reputation, rather than admit what he had done. He looked at Everett Langford with the flat disdain of a man regarding something he has seen before, and was not impressed by then either. "I did not speak up at the time. I was old and I told myself it was not my place." He looked at Amelia. "I was wrong. This is my correction." The room was absolutely silent. Amelia looked at Beaumont, at this small, upright, weathered man who had gotten on a train and ridden 3 days to stand in a church in Montana and say what he should have said 6 years ago, and she felt something move through her that was too big for the available space in her chest. "Monsieur Beaumont," she said, and her voice came out entirely differently than she'd intended. Smaller, more honest. "Ma chère," he said, and the formality dropped for just a moment. And underneath it was the voice of a very old man who had made a mistake and had come a very long way to fix it. "You were always the best of them." Someone in the room was crying. She was reasonably sure it was Danny Holt, and she had the decency not to look. The room began to move then, the particular movement of people redistributing themselves after a verdict. The quiet shuffling of the crowd, as people who had come to witness something different from what they'd gotten began the process of deciding what they now believed and who they now were in relation to it. Everett Langford moved toward the door. He almost made it. "Mr. Langford," it was Caleb's voice, quiet and carrying. From where he stood near the back, Everett stopped. The room went still again. Caleb walked forward through the crowd, which parted for him in the way that crowds part for men who are very certain of where they're going. He stopped in front of Everett Langford and looked at him with an expression that was not anger. It was something colder and more considered than anger. "You came to my property this morning," Caleb said. "You threatened my cook and implied she was not a woman of good character. You then came to this town and told people a story you knew was false in order to damage her reputation and her position." He paused. "You are not welcome in Red Hollow. You are not welcome on my road, at my gate, or within sight of my property. If I see you again, I will take the matter to Judge Carey. And Beaumont here will testify to what he knows." Another pause. "Smaller. Do you understand me?" Everett Langford was a man of considerable pride and considerable practice at maintaining a surface under pressure. He held Caleb's gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he looked away first. "Good evening," he said. to no one in particular, and went out. The door closed behind him. The room exhaled. Then it began to talk. Not to Amelia, or not only to Amelia, it talked to itself. The way rooms do when they've collectively witnessed something and need to process it. The low, urgent murmur of people recalibrating. She stood at the front and breathed and let it happen around her. Beaumont came to stand beside her. He was shorter than she remembered, or she was taller. Time did strange things. "How did you get here so fast?" she said quietly. "I only sent the letter 3 weeks ago. Clara forwarded it to my daughter's house in St. Louis said. "I have been there 6 months, visiting." It was not such a long journey. He paused. It would have come farther. She looked at him. "You should have said something," she said. "When it happened." "Yes," he said simply. No excuse, no justification, just the word. She nodded. "Thank you for coming," she said. "It was long overdue," he said. Margaret Hollis appeared at her elbow. Amelia braced. "Miss Rowe," Margaret said. She had the expression of a woman performing an action she found uncomfortable and had decided to perform it correctly regardless. "I behaved badly. I was told a story, and I didn't look past the surface of it." Because she stopped. Because it was easier to believe than to question. "And I should have questioned." She met Amelia's eyes. "You have my apology." For Amelia looked at her. Margaret Hollis was 55 years old and had been the social standard of Red Hollow for 20 years and had had the Whitaker Ranch with a pie and a poison and had looked at Amelia like something to be managed rather than seen. But she was also standing here now in front of a room full of people, saying I was wrong, and that, Amelia knew, was not a small thing for a woman like Margaret Hollis. That was enormous. "It's worth a great deal," Amelia said. "Thank you, Mrs. Hollis." Margaret nodded, with the relieved precision of a woman who has done something difficult and done it correctly, and is glad to have it finished. She stepped back, and then the young mother came forward, the one with the sick child, who had received the jar of herb preserves. She didn't say anything complicated. She just took Amelia's hand in both of hers and held it for a moment and said, "I'm glad you're here." That was the one that nearly undid her. She held it together by exactly the same margin she'd held it together by in the kitchen, the night Caleb had told her she was the kind of person worth standing beside. Tom Briggs appeared at her other elbow. "You all right?" he said. "Ask me in an hour." "Fair enough," he said. Caleb came to her last. The room had begun to clear, people moving toward the door in 2s and 3s, and Beaumont had been gently claimed by the Reverend and his wife, who wanted to offer him supper and a bed for the night. And it was just Caleb standing in front of her in the emptying church with his hat in his hands, and the particular quality of expression that meant he had things to say and was deciding which ones needed to be said out loud. "You all right?" he said. "Tom just asked me that. What did you tell him?" "Ask me in an hour." Something moved across his face, the almost smile she had come to recognize and had stopped pretending she didn't look for. "I'll ask you in an hour then," he said. She looked at him. At everything he was the steady, unhurried decency of him. The way he had sat across from her at that kitchen table and turned her nightmare into a problem with a solution. The way he had stood at the back of this room tonight and given her exactly what she needed, which was presence without override, support without possession. "You called Tom and Danny and Hector," she said, "to come tonight." "I mentioned there was a meeting," he said. "They decided to come on their own." "Caleb," he looked at her. "Nobody decides on their own to come to a 7 o'clock church meeting on a work night, unless someone they respect tells them it matters," she said. "You told them it mattered." He was quiet for a moment. "It mattered," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. There were things she could say. There were things that had been building in the space between them since the evening she'd stopped moving over a question about chicken fricassee. And some of those things were ready to be said, and some of them needed more time, and she had learned, in the particular school of her own hard history, the difference between those two categories. "Thank you," she said tonight, "for this morning. For All of it. You did the hard part, he said. You made it possible to do the hard part, she said. That's not nothing. He looked at his hat, turned it once in his hands. Looked back at her. I need to ask you something, he said. Her heart did something it hadn't done in 3 years. She held very still. Beaumont, he said. He trained you. He knows your work. He's in St. Louis. He paused. Is St. Louis something you're thinking about? Going back, now that you have his name cleared, now that he stopped. Start it again, you have options now. Real ones. That you didn't have before. She looked at him. She understood the question underneath the question. She understood that what he was actually asking, in the careful, oblique, deeply Caleb Whitaker way of asking the most important things, was whether she was going to leave. She thought about St. Louis, about Chicago, about fine houses and professional kitchens and the world that Beaumont's endorsement had just reopened to her. She thought about what she could do now, with her name intact, with a reference from the only person whose word on the subject mattered. She thought about a small room above a kitchen with an east-facing window and a fixed floorboard, and a recipe book with new pages at the back. She thought about coffee cups and kitchen tables, and a man who fixed things without mentioning it. I'm not thinking about St. Louis, she said. He looked at her. I'm thinking about whether the north garden is big enough to add a second row of herbs before the first frost, she said. And whether the men would tolerate a French onion soup on the menu once a week. And whether that copper pot needs retinning or if I can get another season out of it. A pause. Those are Red Hollow thoughts, he said. Yes, they are, she said. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. And in the way he said it, 2 syllables. No elaboration. The particular completeness of a man who has received an answer that was exactly what he needed and doesn't require it. Repeated, she heard everything he wasn't saying. Which was considerable, and which she filed away carefully for the hour that was coming. They walked out of the church together into the Montana evening. And the stars were beginning to show above the ridge. And Beaumont was on the church steps talking to the Reverend, with his hands moving the way they always did when he was discussing food or France or anything he cared about. And Tom and Danny and Hector were waiting by the wagon, with the patience of men who had done a good thing and were content to let it be. Danny Holt looked at Amelia when she came down the steps, and his face did everything. His face always did communicated every thought in full. Without permission. So you staying? Danny, Tom said. It's a fair question, Danny said. Yes, Amelia said. I'm staying. Danny's face arranged itself into something so comprehensively relieved and happy that she had to look away before it affected her composure. Good, he said, because nobody else can make that gravy. Tom put his hand over his eyes. Old Hector from near the wagon said something in Spanish. What did he say? Danny asked. Something complimentary, Tom said. About the Grammy said. Caleb handed her up onto the wagon bench. She settled beside him, and the reins came up, and the horses moved. And Red Hollow fell away behind them as the wagon turned onto the road east, the road that ran 4 miles through the dark toward the ranch, toward the kitchen, toward the small room with the east-facing window. The stars were enormous above the valley. The air was cool and carried the smell of dry grass and distance. And Amelia Rowe, who had run for 3 years and rebuilt herself in the ruins and run again and rebuilt again, sat on the bench beside a man who had asked her one question and never asked it again, and felt something settle in her chest with the finality of something that has been traveling for a very long time and has finally, definitively arrived. She did not name it yet. She wasn't ready to name it yet. But it was there, solid and warm and entirely real. And the road ahead was dark, and the stars were out. And she was going home. The morning after the church meeting, Amelia came downstairs at her usual hour and found Beaumont already in the kitchen. He was standing at the stove with a cup of coffee. looking at everything the way he always looked at kitchens, the way a craftsman looks at another craftsman's workshop. Cataloging, assessing, noting what was good and what could be better. He had slept at the Reverend's house and arrived back at the ranch before dawn without announcement, which was entirely consistent with every memory she had of him. "You rearranged the shelf," he said, without turning around. "The original arrangement didn't make sense," she said. "It makes sense now," he said, which from Henri Beaumont was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. She poured her own coffee and stood beside him at the stove, and for a moment neither of them said anything. And the kitchen held the particular quality of early morning gray light through the window. The smell of coffee, the sound of the ranch beginning to wake outside. "You built something here," Beaumont said. "I'm building it," she said. "Non," he looked at her. "You built it. Past tense. What comes next is different from building." He gestured at the kitchen, the organized shelves, the herbs drying near the window, the recipe book sitting openly on the shelf rather than locked in a trunk. "This is not a woman starting over. This is a woman who has arrived." She looked at the kitchen. She thought about what it looked like when she first walked into it, the neglected garden, the disorganized shelves, the smell of nothing much. What it smelled like now. It needed someone, she said. "Most things worth having do," he said. The men came in for breakfast at the usual time, and Beaumont sat at the table with them the way he sat in any room, with the complete, unself-conscious ease of a man who has eaten in fine houses and humble ones, and long since decided that the quality of the food mattered more than the quality of the furniture. He ate 2 full plates of her biscuits and eggs and said nothing except to ask Tom Briggs at one point how long he had worked on the ranch. 8 years, Tom said, with a slight wariness that meant he wasn't sure yet what to make of this compact elderly Frenchman. "And the food," Beaumont said. "It was good before?" Tom considered the diplomatic options available to him. "It was sufficient," he said finally. Beaumont looked at Amelia. "Sufficient," he repeated, with the tone of a man filing this under things he found unacceptable. Danny Holt, who had no filter even on his best days, said it was terrible, sir. Truly, the biscuits were like eating a regret. "Danny," Tom said. He asked. Beaumont looked at Danny with an expression that started as disapproval and arrived at something resembling respect. "At least you are honest," he said. "Yes, sir," Danny said, pleased with himself. Caleb came in last, the way he always did. He stopped in the doorway when he saw Beaumont, and there was a brief, assessing pause, 2 men looking at each other the way men do when they are determining what the other one is, what weight to assign him. Then Caleb poured his coffee and sat down and said, "Mr. Beaumont, you're welcome to stay as long as you need." Beaumont looked at him over his cup. "You are the rancher," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Caleb said. "She is well treated here," Beaumont said. As simply as that. A statement of observation, not a question. Not quite a compliment, a fact being recorded. Caleb looked at him. "She is," he said. Beaumont nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who has asked the thing he needed to ask without quite asking it, and received the answer he needed. He had 2 more cups of coffee, and then announced he would walk the kitchen garden, and went outside, and the room exhaled. Danny looked at Tom. "I like him," he said. "You like everyone," Tom said. "That is not true," Danny said, with unexpected dignity, and left for the barn. Caleb remained at the table. Amelia was at the stove, and the kitchen had the particular ease of a room where 2 people have been comfortable in each other's company, long enough that silence doesn't require filling. "He came a long way," Caleb said. 3 days on the train," she said. "That's a man who believes he owed you something." "He did," she said. "And he paid it. That's a rare thing. Most people who owe you something find a reason to believe they don't." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He thinks you built something here," Caleb said. She turned slightly. "You heard that? Sound carries in this house," he said. Unapologetically. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup, and on his was the expression she had learned to read most carefully, the one that meant he was deciding whether to say the thing he was actually thinking. "He's right," Caleb said. "You built something in the kitchen." With the men. Here she held very still. "I know," she said quietly. He looked up. They looked at each other across the kitchen. And in the space between them was everything that had been building since a Thursday evening in late July when she had stopped moving over a simple question about chicken fricassee. Danny knocked on the kitchen door from outside with a question about the north fence. And Caleb rose and went to handle it, and the moment stretched out and became the morning, and was absorbed into the ordinary business of the day. But it stayed with her. It stayed with her all morning. Through the bread and the lunch preparation, and the afternoon quiet. The particular warmth of something she had stopped trying to name, and had simply started allowing to exist. Beaumont spent 2 days at the ranch. He was 70 years old and not built for ranch life. But he was built for kitchens, and he spent considerable portions of those 2 days in hers. Watching her work the way he had always watched people work in his kitchen, with the total, focused attention of a man who was evaluating not just the technique but the relationship between the person and the craft. On the evening of the second day, he sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, "You are better than when I knew you." "I had better ingredients to work with," she said. "Non. The ingredients are the same. You are better." He looked at her with the directness she had always found both intimidating and entirely trustworthy. "You understand now what you are cooking for. Before, you cooked because you were skilled, and because the work was important. Now you cook because," he paused searching, "because there are people whose well-being depends on it, and you have decided that matters. That is different food." She thought about this. "Is it better?" she said. "Always," he said. "Food made for love is always better than food made for pride. Even when the technique is the same." She looked at the table. "I didn't say love," she said. "No," he agreed, "you didn't." She pressed her lips together. The almost smile that crossed his face in response was the most French thing she had ever seen. He left on the third morning, with Tom driving him to the station in Millbrook, which was 20 miles east and had the nearest train connection. Before he left, he pressed something into Amelia's hand on the porch. She looked down. It was a folded piece of paper. "Open it after I've gone," he said. "Old men are sentimental, and I would prefer not to be present when you read it." She closed her hand around it. "Monsieur Beaumont," she said. "Ma," she said. He kissed her once on each cheek the way he always had. The way he had done the morning she left Chicago with her trunk and her recipe book, and no reference and no idea where she was going. He had kissed her cheeks that morning, too, in the back hallway, and whispered, "I am sorry, I should have spoken," and she had not had the capacity to respond because she had been in the specific numb shock of a life dismantling itself. She had the capacity now. "You were the best teacher I ever had," she said. "Whatever came after you gave me the foundation. I built on it. That's yours." "No," he said gently. "What you built is yours. What I gave you was instruction. What you made of it is entirely your own." He patted her hand. "Remember that." He climbed into the wagon. Tom clicked to the horses. And Amelia stood on the porch and watched Henri Beaumont ride down the road away from the Whitaker ranch until the wagon turned the bend and disappeared into the tree line. And then she unfolded the paper in her hand. It was a letter. Short, precise in the sharp European handwriting she had argued with in the margins of a recipe book for 4 years. It said, "To whom it may concern, Miss Amelia Rowe is the finest cook I have trained in 50 years of professional culinary work. Her skill is exceptional, her character is unimpeachable, and any establishment that employs her is fortunate. Any person who tells you otherwise is lying. Henri Beaumont, formerly of the Hargrove household, Chicago." She stood on the porch and held the paper for a long time. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went inside and made lunch. October came in hard and cold, the way Montana Octobers do, with a clarity in the air that was almost aggressive, the kind of cold that makes everything sharp-edged and real. The ranch moved into the rhythms of preparation for winter, which meant long days and harder work, and the particular tired satisfaction of people who have done hard work in cold air and are genuinely glad to come in out of it. The kitchen became the center of gravity of the property, in a way that was even more pronounced in the cold, the stove working harder, the meals heavier and more sustaining, the hours after supper when the men sat longer at the table because the kitchen was warm and the bunkhouse was not yet. Red Hollow had shifted too. Not dramatically, small towns don't shift dramatically. They shift the way geology shifts in increments you can only see in retrospect. But Amelia noticed. The postmaster nodded to her without the extra half-second pause now. The woman from the hardware store had started saving back herbs when she received supply shipments because she knew Amelia would want them. 2 women had come to the ranch specifically to ask her advice about cooking, one about preserving, one about bread, and she had given it freely and without making them feel that the asking was anything other than ordinary. Margaret Hollis had been the largest surprise of all. 3 weeks after the church meeting, Margaret had appeared at the ranch gate on a Tuesday afternoon. Alone, without a pie, she had asked, with the particular stiffness of a woman doing something unfamiliar, whether Amelia would be willing to help plan the food for the church's winter fundraising supper. Amelia had said yes. Margaret had looked relieved and deeply uncomfortable in equal measure, which was probably the most honest expression Amelia had ever seen on her face. "I appreciate it," Margaret said. "I know I have not been." She stopped. "I want to do better." "I know," Amelia said. "Come in. I'll make coffee." Margaret had come in. She had stayed 2 hours. She had eaten 3 biscuits and declared them the finest she'd had in Montana, which Amelia suspected was the most vulnerable thing Margaret Hollis had said to another woman in 20 years. It was a beginning. The evening the story turned again, because stories always turn again. Just when you think the last one was a Thursday in late October. A month to the day, almost, from the church meeting. Amelia was in the kitchen after supper when she heard Caleb's voice from the front room. And then another voice she didn't recognize, and then silence. And then Caleb came through to the kitchen, with its expression that was doing the thing his expressions did when something significant had happened, and he was processing it before he spoke about it. "There's a man here," he said, "from the land office in Millbrook." She looked at him. "What does he want?" Caleb sat down at the kitchen table. He put a document on the table between them. She looked at it. It was legal. She could see that from the language in the opening lines. The formal structure of it. She read further. She looked up. "This is about Langford," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. The document was a legal notice. Everett Langford, it turned out, had not simply been a charming guest of the Hargrove household and a man of casual cruelty. He had, in the time since Chicago, been engaged in a pattern of fraud, the same pattern, applied to different women in different cities, in which he identified women of skill and modest position, convinced them of a future together, extracted what he could from their trust, and moved on. He had done it in St. Louis. He had done it in Denver. And a lawyer in Chicago, retained by 3 of those women together, had been building a case for 18 months. The notice was informational. They were looking for additional witnesses who had experienced his conduct. Beaumont, it appeared, had been talking on the train back to St. Louis. Amelia read the document twice. She set it down. "He did this to others," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "Systematically." She pressed her fingers flat against the paper. "He found women who were good at things, who had built something, and he took it from them. That's what it looks like," Caleb said. She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the other women, the ones in St. Louis, in Denver, the ones whose names she didn't know, but whose experience she understood in her body, the way you understand something that has happened to you. The particular specific damage of having someone decide your work and your trust were available for their use. "I'll testify," she said. He had not looked surprised, which meant he had known she would say this before she said it. "The lawyer will need a statement," he said. "Written. Detailed." "I'll write it tonight," she said. "I'll sit with you if you want," he said. Not offering to help exactly, offering to be present. She had learned the difference. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." They sat at the kitchen table that night for 3 hours, the lamp burning between them, while she wrote the full account of what Everett Langford had done, and Caleb sat across from her with coffee and said nothing except twice to refill her cup without being asked, and once, when she reached a part of the account that was harder to write than she'd anticipated, to simply put his hand over hers on the table for a moment and leave it there until she picked up the pen again. She wrote it all, every detail, every promise Everett had made and broken, every consequence she had lived through. She wrote it clearly and without apology, and without the careful softening she had applied to the story for 3 years out of habit and shame. She wrote it the way Caleb Whitaker stated facts about the ranch plainly. Completely, because it was true and the truth didn't need decoration. When she finished, her hand was tired and the lamp was low, and the ranch was deep in the quiet of late night. She set the pen down. Caleb read the statement through. He did it carefully, the way he did everything thoroughly, without rushing. When he finished, he looked up. "This is good," he said. "It's the truth," she said. "Yes," he said, "that's why it's good." She looked at him across the lamp. There were things that had been waiting in the space between them since a Thursday in July, and had kept waiting through August and September and October. Patient as the ranch itself, waiting for the right moment, the way weather waits, not controllable. But eventually, inevitably arriving. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something I should have said before now. Or maybe I needed everything else to happen first before I could say it. I'm not sure." He waited. No impatience. No pressure. Just the particular quality of attention that was simply how he was made. "I came here to disappear," she said. "To be useful and invisible, and to rebuild enough of my life that I could function. That was all I wanted." She looked at her hands on the table. "I didn't. I had stopped believing in anything beyond that. In anything that wasn't strictly practical." She looked up. "And then I stayed, and you are the most profoundly decent man I have ever known. Caleb Whitaker, and I didn't account for that, and now She stopped. "Now you what?" he said. "Careful." She looked at him. "Now I don't want to be invisible," she said. "I want to be here. I want." She stopped again, pressed her lips together, made herself say the rest of it clearly because she had decided to be done with half measures. "I want whatever is possible here, between us. If anything is." The kitchen was completely still. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I fixed your floorboard in September." She blinked. "I know. I fixed it because the sound of it in the early mornings was the first thing I heard every day," he said. "And I liked it, and I fixed it because I couldn't stand the idea of you stepping around something that should just work right." He paused. "I fixed it because." He stopped. His jaw moved. He was choosing his words with the care he always chose them. But underneath the care there was something she had never heard in his voice before, something unguarded. Something that had come out from behind the 6 years of wall building and was standing in the open for the first time. "Because you matter to me. Because this kitchen and what you've made of it, and what you've made of this place and what you are." He stopped. "You matter to me, Amelia. More than I expected anything to matter again." She looked at him. The lamp was very low between them. "The floorboard," she said. "Yes, you could have just said something." "I'm not good at saying things," he said. "I fix things." Something that was entirely a laugh and entirely a sob tried to come out of her at the same moment and met in the middle and came out as something that was neither, which was probably the most honest sound she had made in years. She reached across the table. She put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held it. They sat like that for a long moment. In the kitchen that had once smelled like nothing much, and now smelled like herbs and warm bread, and the particular warmth of a room that has been lived in by people who take care. And neither of them said anything else for a while, because nothing else needed saying. What came after was not sudden. Nothing about Caleb Whitaker was sudden. What came after was built the same way everything good gets built, one day at a time. One small true thing added to another, until the structure has a weight and a permanence that can stand up to weather. He asked her, 2 weeks later, formally and with a kind of careful, respectful directness that was simply how he was, whether she would consider making her position at the ranch permanent. In all the ways that word implied, she said yes before he finished the sentence. He almost smiled. She decided almost was enough. November brought the first real snow, and the kitchen garden was cut back and covered, but the herbs she had dried through the summer hung in the kitchen and scented everything. And the recipe book sat open on the shelf, open, not locked, not hidden, and new pages were added to it regularly now. Recipes from this kitchen, from this particular place, from the specific combination of what she had learned and who she had become here. The men had learned about the engagement the way the men learned about most things through Danny Holt, who had absolutely no concept of discretion, who had seen Caleb take Amelia's hand at the breakfast table one morning and had announced it to the entire bunkhouse at approximately 6:30 in the evening, with the energy of a man who had personally orchestrated the whole thing. Tom Briggs had said about time. Old Hector had said something in Spanish. What did he say? Danny asked. Something complimentary, Tom said. About the engagement? About the gravy, Tom said. He's consistent. The letter from the lawyer in Chicago arrived in December. Everett Langford, faced with the combined testimony of 4 women and the professional corroboration of Henri Beaumont, had settled out of court. The details were legal and precise and entirely satisfying. He would not practice his particular kind of social predation in Chicago, St. Louis, or Denver again without considerable legal consequence. He had, the lawyer wrote, left the country for a period of time, which the lawyer described in the measured language of legal correspondence as voluntary relocation, and which Amelia translated privately as running. Which seemed right. She read the letter at the kitchen table. Then she folded it and put it in the recipe book, not between the old pages, not in the section that belonged to the life before. She put it at the very back, after the new pages, in the section that was hers. Evidence, she thought, of what happens when you stop running. Christmas at the Whitaker Ranch was something that had not happened properly in 6 years. Caleb had let it pass each year with a minimum observance, required a small acknowledgement that the day existed. A better meal than usual, nothing that resembled celebration. This year was different. Amelia made food for 12. She invited the Reverend and his wife. She invited old Hector's cousin who lived 3 miles south. She invited the young mother with the child, who was now healthy and loud and deeply interested in everything happening in the kitchen. She made a list and she cooked for 3 days, and the kitchen ran continuously, and she ran it with the full force of everything she was capable of, which was considerable. Caleb came into the kitchen on Christmas morning and stopped. The room was everything a room could be: warm, full, smelling of cinnamon and roasting meat and fresh bread and something French that Beaumont had written her the recipe for in a letter last month. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. Eleanor used to do this, he said, quietly. The house used to feel like this. She held very still. I'm not trying to, she started. I know, he said. That's not what I meant. He met her eyes. I mean, I thought this was gone. This feeling in a house. I thought I'd had it once and lost it, and that was how things were. He paused. I was wrong. She looked at him. You don't have to choose between the past and the present, she said carefully. Eleanor was real. What she meant to you is real. This is just also real. He looked at her for a long moment. "How did you get so wise?" he said. "Hard school," she said. "Yes," he said, "I reckon so." He came to the kitchen counter. He stood beside her the way he had stood beside her on 100 mornings, with coffee and the particular ease of two people who have found each other's rhythms and stopped fighting them. He picked up a piece of bread from the board and ate it standing, the way he'd done on his third morning with her biscuits. The morning after she'd been hired, when he'd eaten standing at the stove before the men came in. She had noticed that then. She still noticed it now. She had a feeling she would notice it for the rest of her life. The guests arrived at noon. The table that held 9 people regularly held 12 that day, and held them without complaint, and the food was everything she had intended it to be: abundant, warm, the kind of meal that makes people stay longer than they planned, because leaving seems like the wrong thing to do when there is still food on the table and still warmth in the room. Danny Holt ate 4 plates and had the expression of a man experiencing peak existence. The young mother's child, who was 4 years old and opinionated, climbed into Amelia's lap between courses and announced that the soup was the best thing she had ever eaten and that she intended to learn to cook it. "Good," Amelia said. "Come find me when you're ready." "Tomorrow," the child. "Next year," her mother said. "That's very far away," the child said. "Yes," Amelia agreed. "It is. Which means you have time to practice being patient." The child considered this with the expression of someone who found patience theoretically understandable and personally inaccessible. Then she ate more soup. The Reverend gave a small prayer before the meal that was simple and genuine and included, without editorializing, a specific thanks for the people at this table and what they had built together. And Amelia looked at her plate and breathed, and beside her she felt Caleb's hand find hers under the table and hold it. She held it back. After the guests were gone, and the kitchen was clean, and the men were in the bunkhouse, and the ranch had settled into the particular peace of a Christmas night, Amelia took the recipe book from the shelf. She sat at the kitchen table. She opened it to a fresh page, the last of the new pages. The section that was hers entirely, the record of everything she had made in this kitchen in this life. She picked up a pen. She wrote the Christmas menu. All of it. Every dish, every modification, every combination she had arrived at through the 3 days of preparation. She wrote the notes in the margins the way Beaumont had always insisted, the why as well as the what. The reasoning behind each choice, the way one element played against another. She wrote for an hour. When she was done, she looked at what she'd written, and then she turned back to the first page of the book, the old page. The first recipe in the sharp European handwriting that was not hers, and she read it. And she did not cry, and she did not feel the particular ache that had lived in this book for 3 years. She felt something else, something that was gratitude. Maybe, in the complicated and complete form that only comes when you have survived enough to understand what you survived for. She heard boots on the stairs. Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed for bed, with his hair not quite in order the way it got at the end of long days. He stopped when he saw her at the table. "Still up," he said. "Almost done," she said. He came in and looked over her shoulder at the page she'd written. He read for a moment. "The soup," he said, "the one the child ate 4 bowls of." "She ate 2 bowls," Amelia said. Her mother cut her off. "Yes." "Good," he said. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, warm, solid, entirely certain of itself. "Come up when you're ready." "I will," she said. He went back upstairs. She sat at the table for a moment longer. She looked at the recipe book, all of it, the old pages and the new pages together, the handwriting that was not hers and the handwriting that was, the past and the present bound together in the same worn cover. Everything she had learned and everything she had survived and everything she had built out of both. She closed it gently. She set it on the shelf open position, spine out, the way books are kept when they are being used and will be used again tomorrow and the day after and all the days after that. She turned off the lamp. She stood in the dark kitchen for one moment. Listening to the ranch, the horses, the creek, the deep silence of Montana winter nights that had seemed so absolute and lonely when she first arrived, and now simply sounded like home. Because it was. This was what she had built, not just the kitchen, not just the meals, not just the account books and the herb garden and the recipe pages and the network of small kindnesses that had changed the temperature of this property. She had built herself, again, better than before. Out of whatever materials the world had left her with, and whatever she had carried and whatever she had found here in this particular valley, with this particular man and these particular people who had needed her exactly as much as she had needed them. She had arrived with a locked trunk and a buried name and 3 years of running in her bones, believing she was coming to cook and nothing more. She had been wrong about that. She had been so completely, beautifully, life-changingly wrong about that. She went upstairs. She stepped over the place where the floorboard used to creak and no longer did. She walked down the hall toward the light, still showing under the door. She opened the door. She went in, and Amelia Rowe, who had been told in 100 different ways, by 100 different people, in the specific and general language of a world that had decided what she was worth before she'd opened her mouth, had finally, after everything, arrived somewhere that knew her worth and kept it, and held it, and would not let it go. She had come looking for a place to survive. She had found instead a place to live, and that was everything.